Again, I will probably read words incorrectly. I will stop to make sure I know a word, even if it's simple. I have hard times pronouncing names and sometimes French stuff, so we'll try my best. Still becoming a better reader. Fanon, master and slave. Fanon's master and slave. Fanon has a section, quote, the black person in Hegel, in his Black Skin, White Masks. He summarizes there Hegel's master-slave dialectic and uses this paradigm to analyze the relationship between contemporary whites and black people. That Fanon took up the discussion of Hegel so directly, it is not at all surprising. Hegel's paradigm had theoretical relevance to a topic that for a long time had engrossed Fanon, namely the relationship between white masters and black slaves. Moreover, as we noted earlier, Kojevi's interpretation of Hegel had considerable impact on French intellectual thought, particularly that occurring during Fanon's formative years. Jean-Paul Sartre, whom Fanon admired and read with much interest, had already used Hegel's paradigm in anti-Semitism and Jewish people. This book in particular had greatly impressed and stimulated the young Fanon. Yet, although Fanon benefited from Hegel's master-slave dialectic, he also needed to reformulate and extend the abstract paradigm so that he could apply it to concrete living experience under slavery and colonialism. This is his addition, yes. As we have seen, Fanon needed to reformulate, extend, and create paradigms in his critical thinking. The same need asserted itself in regard to his treatment of Freud's psychoanalysis, Jung's analytic psychology, and Adler's individual psychology. That Fanon benefited from and then reformulated a paradigm on the important topic of oppression was quite understandable. European philosophers, including Hegel and Covey, had characteristically ignored the wretched servitude and torment of black people under slavery and colonialism. Even when they studied the problems of oppression in Europe, they tended to approach it from academic ivory towers. Their thoughts of oppression this is the one I'm talking about, a word incollectible. Find out. It's a simple word, but for me, once I get it, I'll be like, oh no, that's what it was.
Ineluctable.
Ineluctably, which is in a way that is impossible to avoid, escape, or resist. So their thoughts of oppression, hold on. Ineluctably had the quality of philosophical fascination and subjective distance. To Fanon, in contrast, the experience of slavery and colonialism had a personal intimacy and urgency. He was himself a descendant of slaves, at least of his maternal side. His country and people were still languished under colonialism. Moreover, his daily encounter with racism in France continually brought home to him the tormenting residues of slavery. His clinical observation of tortured and shattered personalities as the colonial Algeria and elsewhere again underscored for him a global dimension of European assault on people of color. His identification with the victim was unambiguous since, as he admitted, the oppressed were his brother, his sister, his parents. Fanon could not therefore approach the master-slave dialectic with a cold detachment of the academician. Make sure. I won't even do it all. Come on. Come on. Hold on, I gotta make sure I'm saying this word correctly. It takes me forever. A-C-A-D-E-M-I-C. It's academia. I think it's academian. Yeah, academian. Yeah. An academian. His emotional engagement and clinical insights combined to an unrivaled, hitherto neglected, but crucial aspects, namely the human anguish and psychopathology of the master-slave dialectic. In recapitulating Hegel's master-slave dialect, Fanon underscored the necessity of recognition to transform, quote, the subjective certainties into objective truths. He also concurred that recognition is unattainable without struggle, and that this struggle entails the risk of life. In particular, Fanon emphasizes the essentiality of reciprocal recognition for human life and relatedness. Without reciprocal recognition, there can be no identity, no self-worth, no dignity. One is human to the extent he surpasses the immediate, projects himself into the future, and above all, reaches out for the other in order to confirm and be confirmed. Denied this possibility, one becomes steeped in wretched servitude and objecthood. Psychic and social development is undermined, suppressed, and arrested. Under such circumstances, there is only one human and liberating response, a, quote, S-word struggle, and possibly a convulsion of death. Fanon 1967 says, I am not merely here and now sealed into thingness. I am for somewhere else and for something else. I demand that notice be taken of my negating activity insofar as I pursue something other than life, insofar as I do battle for creation of a human world, that is, a world of reciprocal recognition. He who is reluctant to recognize me imposes me in a, quote, S-word struggle. I am willing to accept convulsion of death, invincible disillusion, but also the possibility of the impossible. This is Fanon when he wrote Black Skins, White Math. These remarks stay close to Hegel's formulation, but they also reflect Fanon's initial emphasis on reciprocal recognition. Despite many efforts as an individual, Fanon desires for reciprocal recognition was frustrated in the racist France he knew. The frustration precipitated a existential crisis. The other, white and narcissistic, insisted that he not only be recognized, but also worshipped. At the same time, so that's white people, not only should be recognized, but we should be worshipped, is what he's saying. And at the same time, he is reluctant to even concede the humanity of a black man. Yet in his early stage, despite the stubbornness of others, Fanon hoped that an all-out violent showdown could be averted. His frustrations and anguish were tempered by his belief in the potency of reason. The commitment about the S-word struggle and possibly convulsion of death was at this period only a statement of conviction, not a program of action. Fanon was still convinced that reason would prevail over unreason. All one had to do was explain and mark the other understanding. Unfortunately, the white masters proved stubborn and impervious to reason. The other remained adamant. He continued to hurl his accustomed radical obscenities. Let me make sure that says obscenities, so I don't want to misrepresent that. Do. O-B-S-E-N-I-T-I-E-S. Obscenities. as an expression or behavior that are deeply offensive, insist and seated, load and distinguished to contemporary community standards. Okay. His subtle but corrosive glances persisted. He patronized, oppressed, and exploited. Thus, inevitably, his concern over the master-slave dialectic remained with Fanon till death. Its formulation changed in time and with experience, but the theme and concern persisted. In the introduction of his first book, Fanon pointed out that there are two camps, one white, the other black. Two camps represent a Manichaean opposition, a perpetual conflict, white versus black. Each camp suffers in its own disaster. The disaster of the white man, Fanon asserts, derives from the fact that he killed man. The disaster of the black man rests on the fact that he was once a slave. Because of this dual disaster, human history and psyche had been taken a peculiar turn. The white man is sealed in his superiority complex, and the black man is insinuated into his inferiority complex. The former wants to elevate himself to the status of a demagogue and seek to keep black people in their place, quote unquote. The black man wants to become white, or this wish frustrated reacts with envious resentment, meaning that whiteness as a construct needs to go away because it's an antagonistic. It rises the identity of non-white people. The superiority complex of the white master and of the inferiority complex of the black slave pervade all race relations. And the psychology of the two camps. The white master imposes his language and culture on the black slave. The latter subsequently strove to adopt the master diction, outlook, and behavior. The white master used black women as sexual objects. He graped with impunity, and his sexual escapades brought forth a new breed, the so-called biracial person. They use the M word, by the way, everybody, who made the two camps even more fluid. The biracial person wanted to avoid it slipping back. The black slipping back. The black wanted to turn white, the notch higher in his being. But the white master frustrated this wish for assimilation. He warily guards the boundaries dividing the two camps, even though his sexual adventures blur it insignificantly. Whenever black people strove to achieve racial liquefaction and culture assimilation, the master redefined the boundaries, divided the two camps to suit his whims, and tenaciously defended it. If and when he was not swinging rifle butts and kicking with leather boots, he simply patronized and condescended to and infantilized the black slave, applying the master-slave paradigm to the condition in the diaspora. Fanon emphasized that risk of life is a precondition for freedom. He thus made a distinction between the black slave and the French Antilles, who argued Fanon was set free without a fight, and the black American, who constantly, quote, battles and is battled. The former granted freedom without a fight and said to know nothing of value of freedom. His misconstrues freedom to mean simply the granting of permission to eat at the master's table, assume his attitudes, and adopt his behavior, because the answer, the negation, is getting rid of whiteness and white supremacy. And in order to do that, you have to get rid of the world system of capitalism and capitalist exploitation, who utilizes this construct in order to keep them in dominant positions. They utilize it within class and other things. I think it's bled into class, honestly. Where still he feels grateful for hollow proclamation and camouflage of slavery. The change he has undergone is superficial and deceptive. It is simply a shift from one style of life to another, not a fundamental transformation from one life to another. Fanon was more optimistic about the future of black Americans who battles and is battled, ED, than that of the French Antillean, who is granted freedom by his masters. He believes that the magnificent momentum of reconciliation was about to be erected on the battlefield of Black American freedom fighters had fallen, quote, and on top of this monument, I can already see a white man and a black man hand in hand, end quote. Fanon's characterization of the French Antillean as the slave granted false freedom without the fight, many be a matter of debate. So basically what he's saying is, if they recognize you, but they still recognize you as a subhuman, but you can come to the table, but you're not going to get the status of the civilized matter of the historical civilization of white people, quote unquote. The debate would be mostly likely to be on the presumed absence of a fight, not how superficial this freedom, not on how superficial this freedom is, which recent developments confirm. Present conditions in the United States hardly justified Fanon's obvious optimism for black people. Fanon's master-slave paradigm was particularly entrenched with a committed praxis and clinical observation in colonial Algeria. So he's utilizing that theory and putting it to into the reality by utilizing the practice of it, like understanding the theory behind it and observing it. His conception of freedom subsequently changed. His thoughts about the best means of attaining it shifted, and the target audience for his writing became less diffused. His previous hopes for reciprocal recognition gave way to an emphasis of reclaiming freedom and self-determination for the oppressed. Appeals to rationality and sensibility of the oppressor have proven futile, for supplanted with the determination of participants in violent showdowns. Underscore where the significance of violence, the primacy of land and national consciousness, the importance of political organization, the ethics of responsible leadership, and the need for creative thought, and the betrayal of, quote, the native intellectuals, long pampered by the European oppressors, because they want them so they can, yeah, I get it. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon, 1968, masterpiece of decolonization, the violence in the master-slave dialects, takes on a paramount catastrophic significance. Colonialism also reveals itself simply as another stage of slavery. The colonized relationship is thus a derivative of the master-slave relationship. See, that's yeah. And analysis of one reveals the essential of the other. Concern with greater master-slave relations in Fanon's first book gave way to an analysis of colonizer and colonized relationship in his later works without a shift in substance. Indeed, practice and experience of colonial Algeria illuminated the coordinates of the oppressor-oppressed dialectic. Fanon again emphasizes that the colonial world is divided into two. It is the Manichaean world, black and white. Two camps inhabited by two different species and perpetual conflict. The two protagonists live in reciprocally exclusive zones. Their neighborhoods, their nutrition, their health, their manner of life and death. All these are a stark contrast. The settler town, here we go. I think this is where you're going to find out when he applies that dialectic to the colonizer and the colonized. The settler towns is a strongly built town, all made of stone and steel. It is a brightly lit town. The streets are covered with asphalt. The garbage cans swallow all the leavings. The settler town is a well-fed town, an easygoing town. Its belly is always full with good things. The settler town is a town of white people, of foreigners. That's one contrast, that's one position. The town belonging to the colonized people, or at least the native town, the black village, the Medina, the reservation, is a place of ill fame, peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there. It matters little where or how. They die there. It matters not where nor how. It is a world without spaciousness, Men live there on top of each other. Their huts are built on top of each other. The native town is a hungry town, starving of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, and of light. It is a town of N-words and dirty A-words. Arabic people, sorry. So that's the contrast. Those are the two contrasts that he's describing in the book, The Wretched of the Earth. The contrast is much in environment and health as it is in values, thought, and destiny. For in every respect, the colonizer and the colonized are locked in a deadly combat that affects all aspects of life, kind of like the indigenous population and the state here. And also, I would say even go to black people too, because whiteness itself is an antagonistic trait. It's the bourgeois position, in a sense, when it comes to race. The colonizer considers himself an embodiment of supreme good, but portrays the colonized as the incarnation of evil. The colonized, in turn, is amused with his self-delusions of the oppressor as he covertly entertains his moral superiority or prepares for the final assault of his oppressors. The colonizer, ruthless and exhibitionistic, applies maximum violence, bayonets, cannons, and napalm. Soon or later, however, the colonized learn that his salvation lies only in greater violence because it's self-defense. Violence needs to be met with violence. The colonizer is convinced that he alone is a forger of history, and others are simply the fodder. This is the colonizer. His history books are replete with self-adulation. One reads about the exceptional valor or conquering of generals, the remarkable justice of colonial administrators ruling S-words, the inspiring dedication of European educators, literally illuminating a, quote, dark continent, end quote, and the selfless devotion of missionaries saving, quote, heathens from hellfire, with the exception of misguided converts and assimilated intellectuals. However, the colonized now deep down at these claims of the oppressor are but self-delusions elaborated into the culture of lies. More fundamentally, they realize that this educational propaganda and religious proselytization are but different expressions of the same violence. The colonizer imposes on society, culture, and psyche. Yet, so long as the colonized concept servitude for fear of death, so long as he is willing to die for freedom, the colonizer is tyrannical and violent without limit. Meanwhile, the colonized patiently remarks time and ekes out his existence in a ever narrowing margin of survival. His accumulated rage deflects from its deserving target, namely the oppressor. He turns in on himself and his people. He seeks magical means of exercise and explains away this rage. But when much maneuvers fail to achieve the freedom and dignity of which he dreams 24 hours a day, the more his oppression intensifies. And when he discovers that the oppressor can be killed, this discovery shakes just his social and psychological world to its foundation. Acting on that discovery demystifies the omnipotence of the oppressor and resorts his self-confidence and self-respect. This discovery ushers in a long-awaited revolutionary struggle to ensure that, quote, the last shall be the first, and the first shall, and the first last, end quote. Thus, according to Fanon, oppression is above all else the practice and institutionalization of violence, both crude and subtle. This pervasive violence imposes a Manichaean world, corrodes basic human values, and dehumanizes all involved. The exploitation that motivates and perpetuates this violence is not only economic, but also psychological and cultural. Fanon's experience in Algeria in the Algerian War for independence forced him to reformulate his earlier view. hopes of reciprocal recognition through reason have long proven futile. The oppressor was still adamant and permeable to reason. There remained one and only one recourse: to practice and organize counter-violence against the oppressor. Freedom is not given, it must be taken and defended. The oppressor have become the oppressor. The oppressor have become the oppressor through the practice of violence. Only understand and yield to counter-violence. The practice of counter-violence, in addition, fosters cohesion among the oppressed, purges them from their complexities, and rehabilitates the alienated. In short, the revolutionary counter-violence of the oppressed brings forth a new language, a new people, and a new humanity. Yep, I agree. So that's Fanon, utilizing the slave dialectics in the conditions of colonized and colonizers. So the colonized, wants to be seen as a demigod, seen as a deity, to be looked at as a god, and that in order to do that, we have to oppress non-white people to prove our status and our identity by proving their identity as like non-human, something to be ruled over. Hold on a second, let me see who's in here. I don't know this person, okay. Master, slave, reconsidered. When Hegel, does anybody have any questions before I move on? I know it's just you and me, Joe. All right, looks like no.
No, I don't have any questions.
When Hegel wrote his classic, The Phenomenology of the Mind, in 1807, Europe's conquest of the rest of the world was in its heyday. Hegel was foremost an historian and a philosopher. Europe's violent past and unfolding present he knew too well. With the Odyssey, wait, I don't know this word. No, not that one. There we go. I'm gonna make sure I said this word right. Acuity? Or maybe it's acuity. Let's find out. We're gonna find out.
Acuity.
I did it right. The sharpness and keenness of perception, the sense, such as aversion or hearing, or the intellect. Acuity. With the acuity and the brilliant insider, his master-slave paradigm no doubt contains significant insights into one of the most tragic aspects of human relations. Remember also that this is the comrades have put it this way too, that it's a part of a social relations. The social construct is part of the social relations, and capitalism rises social relations too. Hegel focused attention on the pervasive problems of oppression that many other European giants, including Freud, had either completely ignored or at best indirectly intimated. Hegel thus stimulated needed discourse. Hegel thus stimulated needed discourse on an important human problem that seems esoteric and irrelevant to many European intellectual elites who knew or cared little about the downtrodden and oppressed. What is more, Hegel's clarification of self-consciousness, recognition, conflict, and the necessity of risking life for freedom remains pivotal in understanding the transforming situation of oppression. That Euro-American psychologists have ignored Hegel's paradigm and the sequence discourse on oppression has had the effect of insulting them into a mode of thinking in which the concept and reality of oppression lacks meaning and urgency. Familiarity with that paradigm and the participation in the subsequent discourse would underscore for them the fact that oppression is crucial feature of social existence, and moreover, that the question of oppression is primarily a problem of psyches confronting each other in society. Covey's interpretation and extension of Hegel is also highly instructive and stimulating. It is a replete with psychological hypotheses, which, if taken seriously, could signify shift how psychologists study human problems and what human problems they study. The centrality of desire for human action, the meaning of consequences, of, quote, actions itself, the difference of self-consciousness and sentiment of self, the primacy given to man as a social being, a role of conflict and intersubjectivity in history. These and others suggest a different perspective than the psychology currently taught, practiced, and used for profit. The current emphasis of sexual and aggressive instincts, the reduction of human action to simple, discrete, and quantifiable behaviors, the application of, quote, social psychology to a narrow subspeciality, and tangential relevance to clinical personalities and developmental concerns. This tradition of selective inattention and reductionism must change if psychology is to have relevance to the globe and urgent problems of oppression. For however brilliant and helpful in certain conditions, the insight gained from Victorian Europe, or the principle distilled for the studies of rats, cannot, without significant modifications, be responsive to the priorities and concerns of the oppressed. Hegel and Covey formulation thus add important considerations that psychologists often ignore or address superficially. Yet, in spite of Hegel's monumentous contribution, his paradigm is sorely limited for us as much as it is purely academic and European in outlook. In particular, the paradigm narrows the complex problem of slavery into a contestation only for abstract ends, i.e. recognition, when in fact socioeconomic motivations are at least as significant. The paradigm also reduces to the individual combat what indeed has been a deadly confrontation of people, cultures, and psyches. Moreover, Hegel ignored the unprecedented devastation of that colossal slavery in which the master was white and the slave was black. Experience under actual slavery, not to mention the agony of enslavement of enslaved black people, were too remote and speculative for Hegel, because he didn't experience it, he didn't see it, he only read it, I guess. Yep, that's bad. That's sad. Indeed, no wonder if his paradigm reveals more about the psychology of enslaving Europe than universal trivials of the human condition. His views on the redeeming effect of work is, for instance, an interesting version of the Protestant ethic. Hegel romanticizes the effect of forced labor because he lacked the intimate awareness of the crushing weight of real slavery and colonialism. Mannone analysis of the colonial situation is no doubt bold and original, particularly instructive in his method of self-analyzing and examination of the projective content of literary works to study the collective unconsciousness. It was crucial to inquire into, as Mannone did, what actually impelled Europeans to distant lands in order to conquer, dominate, and dehumanize others. Why, for instance, have Europeans and even descendants historically been so obsessed with the delusion of racial superiority and the wish to dominate? Equally important is the speculation whether there existed psychological preconditions like the dependency complex among the colonized long before their would-be oppressors arrived. Mannone posed this neglected question and provided some tantalizing answers. In our view, Mannone is at his best when he analyzes the psychology of colonizers and the core conflicts spawned by European civilization. In contrast, his analysis of the colonized psyche falters because of its Eurocentric, ahistoric, and misleading. Not only did Mannone regulate the colonized psyche into a perpetually infantile stage of development, but he also erroneously assumed that colonized people willingly submitted to European domination without the bloody wars of resistance, which they did have wars, which I discuss elsewhere. His pseudo-liberal and pastoralistic outlook confounds his analysis to the colonized psyche. The dependency complex is, as we argued earlier, not a cause but rather a consequence of colonialism, and thus confusing an effect for the cause and thereby blaming the victim. Benoni remained true to the psychological traditions analyzed in Chapter 5. It is very significant that both Hegel and Benoni emphasize that domination originates in the quest for self-realization, achieved only through conquest of others. For Hegel, self-consciousness is unattainable without recognition from and conflict with the other. Man is human only to the degree he imposes his will on the other, forces this other into bondage, and thereby transforms subjective reality into objective truth. Whatever else may follow in the Hegelian dialectic, at least this much is assumed as given in human history. For Benoni, the European psyche is afflicted with the inferiority complex and the misanthropy that, on the other hand, fosters elaboration of a higher civilization, and, quote, on the other, prominence and superiority complex as a defense and desire to dominate others and provide a lure to live in the world of half-witted, subhuman Calibans. Hegel's formulation is certainly more complex and richer than Benoni's, yet the analysis of both reveal more the dilemmas and propensities of European collective psyche than what is necessarily universal or inevitable in the human condition. Intended or not, admitted or denied, both analyses shed light on what very collective psyche of Europe that required massive dehumanization of others in order to validate its own humanity. If both Hegel and Benoni eliminated the core conflict and violent propensities of the European psyche, if they shed light on what impelled Europeans towards domination of others, neither, however, was able to clarify the actual trivial and dilemmas of the oppressed psyches. Their analyses of the enslaved and colonized were less penetrating and illuminating. Hegel's analyses of the oppressed was romantic and speculative, whereas Benoni's was married with ethnocentrism and patriotism. Their accounts of the oppressor are richer precisely because the predatory history of Europe permeated their personal experience and background. Little wonder then that what they revealed through self-analysis, examinations of the projective content of European literature, and philosophical inquiries form a coherent exposition of European psyche amidst with violence, misanthropy, and domination. But their analysis of the enslaved and colonized faltered because the experiential domain of the oppressed and downtrodden was for them remote from the perspective of personal circumstances and values. It's almost like a white person trying to know the ins and outs of the black experience underneath a white world. There's no way, because the experiences of it and actually feeling it are different than ones that don't feel it. I mean, yeah, sure, we can feel oppression, but we don't feel racism. We don't feel the dehumanization as a person of a certain color or a person phenotype. You know what I mean? For in the Manichaean world, Europe had created the gulf separating the existential imperatives of two irreconcilable species, pitted against each other, oppressor and the oppressed, whites and black people, should not simply be bridged by a leap of imagination, however brilliant or well-intended, to comprehend life in the camp of the oppressed, to penetrate into the experience of those in the inferno below. More was required than the analytic acuity or an academic view from the shores of the oppressor. That's why in Marxism, the materialist part is to meet the material, to meet the world where it's at, and to understand and observe and have the evaluations. And so, yeah. When Fanon focused his discussion on oppressed black people, he directed attention not so much to the whys of oppression, as Hegel and Benoni did, but to how the violence of oppression dehumanizes all involved. This shift from the way to the how of oppression reflected Fanon's sense of urgency and search for the practical solution neither Hegel nor Benoni sought. Moreover, Fanon analyzed the dynamics of oppression with the passion of a man deeply scarred by the harsh realities of the enslaved and the colonized. So he said that even the colonizers were affected by this construct. He too was at once enriched and limited by the existential grounding in one of the two Manichaean camps. And because he was rooted in the world of the oppressed, with which he completely identified, Fanon was at his best in clarifying the dilemmas and dynamics of the downtrodden. He used self-analysis, clinical data, and social analysis to reveal the trivial and conflicts of the oppressed. Unfortunately, his ultimate death at the age of 36 did not permit him to further develop his seminal ideas or implement his purposeful for psychosocial rehabilitation. Nevertheless, when his contributions are considered along with the history of slavery and apartheid, crucial features of the master-slave dialect and the psychology of oppression can be delineated. First and foremost, as Fanon pointed out, the problem of oppression is a problem of violence. The violence may be crude or subtle. Often it is both. Yet it is this aspect of oppression that is most prone to confusion and to mystification. This is so precisely because those who monopolize the benefit from violence find it convenient to obfuscate and mystify the meanings of reality of violence. They enlist the service of religion, the law, science, and media to confound and bewilder even the oppressed, who otherwise would recognize that the social order is founded on and permeated by violence. But this pervasive and structural violence is often masked and rationalized as a natural order of life. Thus, there is legitimate and illegitimate violence, and for the former deriving legitimacy by using the superior force and covenant legal edicts, not by the actual consent of the oppressed. Those who monopolize the benefit from violence typically judge their violence as necessary, justified, and for the good of all. Any exercise of self-defense to ward off the violence of the social order is viewed with alarm and considered illegitimate. Kind of like what we say when Hamas is trying to fight for their independence from a settler colonial thing. We call them the aggressors. We call them anybody who resists against anything like whiteness or the state or any kind of capitalist thing. They're the transgressors, not the other way around. The oppressed are permitted, not right, or permitted no right of self-defense, no due process of law. Any remark by one of their leaders concerning self-defense, as when Malcolm X stated, self-protection, quote, by any means necessary, end quote, is quickly denounced and scandalous. A threat to society, or even a delirious ranting of a man gone wild. But the policeman who unprovoked shoots one of the oppressed or breaks head with batons is likely to be hailed as a protector of justice, a defender of the law, of quote, law and order. Simply put, in the oppressor system of justice, might is right, weakness, eternal guilt. And weakness, eternal guilt. The dynamics of oppression and of the violence it entails are best exemplified in the master-slave relations. Hegel's paradigm no doubt overstates the primacy of individual traits like courage and risk of life in the genesis of oppression. He did not consider the potency of superior arms, better organization of war, the European goal, in the enslavement of colonization of Africans, as we pointed out in chapter 3. Yet Hegel stated a fundamental of all oppression when he assumed that the two protagonists are necessarily locked in a deadly combat, and that once oppression is imposed, freedom cannot be regained without risking life. In this sense, then, the Hegelian paradigm acknowledges the centrality of violence in the imposition, maintenance, and eventual negation of oppression. So violence is the negation of oppression by the oppressor, by the oppressed. If freedom requires a risk of life, oppression too requires a fear of physical death. Do you see the dialect? Do you see that? Let me read it again. If freedom requires the risk of life, oppression too requires the fear of physical death. It is axiomatic that oppression can never be imposed or maintained without the exercise and threat of violence. Historically, most of those of whom oppression was imposed had first put up a violent resistance. Many among them fought historically and gave their lives for freedom. Oppression took root only when the fear of physical death exceeded the will to freedom. Defeat often heralds fear of physical death among survivors. Thus, more than to superior arms, the oppressor owes his power to fear the physical death, to fear of physical death. This is one of the reasons why the psychological dimensions of oppression is so significant. For it and when the oppressed overcome this fear, superior arms, violence, and the oppressor lose their potency. The fear of physical death without which oppression cannot be imposed is first of all a characteristic of individuals. At its most elemental level, as fear is experienced individually and existentially. This fear inevitably crystallizes as a conflict between the individual wish for physical survival and the community social historical survival. This fear pits immediate and animals' instincts against long-range higher ideals. One cannot succumb to fear of physical death and at the same time work to preserve the culture values and collective goals that are challenged. Whenever fear of physical death gains prominence, tyranny and exploitation flourish. The individual who places a premium on biological survival becomes uprooted from his community's ideals, history, and destiny. And the more the oppressed seek physical survival, the more their oppression deepens and the more frequent betrayal becomes. The fear of physical death not only hinders the possibility of freedom, but also limits productive and meaningful living. Those who submit to oppression may continue to breathe, eat, and sleep. They may congratulate themselves for having preserved biological life. Unfortunately, however, when they only exchange one form of death for another. This is so because as they submit to oppression and preserve biological life, they invariably suffer a degree of psychological and social death. Even their physical survival remains tenuous. They enjoy a stay of execution so long as they serve the interests of the oppressor. But their psychological and social death continues without interruptions so long as their free of physical death persists. Orlando Patterson, 1982, came to a similar conclusion in his brilliant and comprehensive study of slavery. He identified three constituting elements of slavery that are worthy of note. First, the master-slave relations was founded on interpersonal and institutional violence. The master's absolute power and the slave's total powerlessness rest on the use and threats of violence. Forced to the state of powerlessness and helplessness, the slave became a human surrogate, an instrument of the master's self and will. Second, the slave was subjected to a state of, quote, natal alienation, end quote. Thereby, his genealogical and cultural moorings were obliterated. To be without a legitimate or recognized bond with others, by they dead, living, or unborn, amount to being a, quote, social dead person. Third, a distinctive feature of the slave was his generalized conditions of dishonor. For in his eyes and those of others, his persons and status lacked integrity, worth, and autonomy. From this, it follows that slavery was the ultimate of human domination and exploitation. Those on whom slavery was imposed were spared physical death, as long as they remained living tools of their masters. In exchange, they submitted to death in three domains: personality, social bonding, and culture. They suffered depersonalization, desocialization, and I don't know this word. I'm gonna try it. Derenation. I don't know how to say it. Let's do this word. Eraciation. Please say it. Oh, it's not gonna let me say it. Derenation. An act or process of pulling something up by the roots or detaching something from their native environment, culture, or tradition. Let's see if I can get a pronunciation. No, of course not. I have to do this thing.
We traveled back through time, not to conquer these beasts, but to survive with them.
Hold on a second. Deracination, according to this person. Deracination. And deracination. Their outward behaviors were congruent with their wishes, needs, and psychic life. Their relations to others, even in their loved ones, were rendered illegitimate and meaningless. Their culture and history were also uprooted, derailed, and made appendages of those of their masters. To a varying degree and intensity, these three forms of death exist in most situations of oppression. It is important to appreciate, in a situation of oppression, the various mechanisms of social control that complement, refine, and deepen the violence of the oppressor. Brutal and blatant violence is insufficient to produce an obedient slave. For a situation of oppression to be effective, various methods of social control must pervade the life of the oppressed. Among the first freedoms to be curtailed are basic freedoms, like those of movement, expression, of opinion, or curtailed are basic freedoms, like those of movement, expression, or I'm reading again, of opinions and assembly. The oppressed is made a prisoner within narrow circles of tamed ideas and wrecked ecology and social networks strewn with prohibitions. His family and community life is infiltrated in order to limit his capacity for bonding and trust. His past is obliterated and his history falsified to render him without an origin or a future. A system of reward and punishment based on loyalty to the oppressor is instituted and fostered competition and conflicts among the oppressed. Now they're going over such methods of social control best exemplify in slavery and apartheid, making the psyche of social relations of the oppressed the locus of control and domination. When the oppressor harshes prohibition and threats are enacted in family and interpersonal relationships, problems of oppression and hits of violence become infused with the founding ambivalence of guilt. This intensity of oppression, even when loved ones have adopted the oppressor's value and norms, is most difficult to change. Any attempt towards changing these entail the confrontation of those one has come to love or respect or consider significant others What is more, the institutionalization of oppression in daily living also entails the internalization of the oppressor's value, norms, and prohibition. Internalized oppression is most resistant to change, since the world requires a battle of two fronts, the oppressor within and the oppressor without. Prolonged oppression reduces the oppressed into mere individuals without a community or a history, fostering the tendency of privatized, a share victimization. Thus, one observes contrast attitudes and behaviors between the two protagonists in situations of oppression. When a member of the oppressing group meets a member of the oppressed, the first always acts as a majority, while the latter behaves simply as a minority of the minority of one. The former demands more space and privilege. The latter tends to settle for less. The former excludes confidence and a sense of entitlement. The latter betrays self-doubt and readiness to compromise. Consciously and unconsciously, each know that their personal encounter is also an encounter of two collective with unequal power. The prevailing ideas, values, and rules to conduct serve the former. They entrap and frustrate the latter. The one who is a member of the oppressing group exploits all this. The other compensates with his personality and individual resources. The oppressed find everyday living a challenge. The oppressed. The narrow and rigid confines in which the oppressed are entrapped by laws and rules of conduct requiring a marked degree of repression and personal versatility. Stripped of a collective aura, the oppressed tend to think, dream, and act as a helpless minority of one. The oppressed learn to wear many masks for different occasions. They develop skills to detect the moods and wishes of those in authority, learn to present acceptable public behaviors while repressing many incongruent private feelings, and refine strategies for passive-aggressive behavior. This pattern of adoption no doubt entails a personal toll, an excessive use of energy, and a higher vulnerability for psychopathology. Though a human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, there is also a threshold for what is tolerable. It should therefore not be surprised if the oppressed often complain of many somatic afflictions and, quote, wandering organ syndromes. Or suddenly erupt in rage, persecute scapegoats, abuse substance, and take murderous actions against relatives or friends. Oppression pervades more aspects of life. The longer it prevails, its various forms of violence also become harder to discern, and the more one is oppressed. Yet, as suggested by Professor Chester Pierce, it is possible to identify several key indicators for objectively assessing degrees of oppression. All situations of oppression violate one's space, time, energy, mobility, bonding, and identity. The oppressed find his and her physical and psychological space unacknowledged, intruded into, and curtailed. The oppressed is not allowed any claim to territoriality, nor is he or her privacy respected. Of the 24 hours of each day, there is less time the oppressed can call his or her own, to be used at will for self-development or leisure. The energy of the oppressed is often depleted, expropriated, and harnessed to advance the oppressor's interest. The movements of the oppressed is controlled and curbed. Equally crucial, his or her bonding with others is subverted, weakened, and rendered conflictual. His or her personal, and as well as collective identity is also challenged, undermined, and confused. The slave's best exemplifies the relevance of these 6 indicators of oppression. The male slave was allowed no physical space which he could call his own. The female slave had even less claim to space than the male slave. Even her body was someone else's property. Commonly ignored is how this expropriation of one's body entails even more dire consequences for female slaves. The walking hours of the slave were also expropriated for life without his or her consent. The slave labored in the field and in the kitchen for the gain and comfort of the master. The slave's mobility was curbed, and he or she was never permitted to venture beyond the designated perimeters without a, quote, pass. The slave bonding with others, even the natural relations between mother and child, was violated and eroded. The same violation of space and time, energy, mobility, bonding, and identity prevails under apartheid, which in effect is a modern-day slavery. Life is actually inconceivable without space, time, energy, mobility, bonding, or identity. How a community allocates and uses space, or in the most materialist perspective, how it disrupts ownership and control of land, reflects its values, economics, health, and quality of life. Equally, the rhythm of life in all development processes presuppose the category of time. As man strives for immortality, a fleeting presence recedes into a forgotten but potent past. Developmental milestones are passed in time. Plans are made for an unfolding and uncertain future. Moreover, the capacity to act, and particularly to work, in the word energy, is a measure of how and by what means an individual lives and objectifies his or her potential. Mobility permits fulfillment of needs and flight from danger in our environment of action and reaction. Bonding with others is so basic that without it, neither development of self nor life is possible. The identity provides an anchor of individuality and continuity with others. These 6 dimensions thus define, determine, and substantiate the human psyche. The space and time we inhabit, the energy and mobility and available to us, the social bonding that forms, fulfills, and nurtures us, the sense of self and awareness of its possibilities. These are the foundations of human psychology. Any attempt to seek to elucidate the psychology of oppression, but ignores the importance of these dimensions, is misleading and invasive. This is so because when all is said and done, the question of oppression is also a question of control and or violation of at least these basic dimensions of life. Oppression is motivated by economic, social, and psychological gains that in the end entail the manipulation and usurpation of these life domains. To focus only on inferior needs or debates on the innate racial qualities serves to distract attention from these nodule dimensions that could empirically be studied and changed. Thus, by emphasizing the disruption of and control of these nodule dimensions, we can objectively answer those needs are fulfilled or frustrated. How this is achieved and what psychology of the self is subsequently elaborated. Every psyche, of course, indulges in a degree of narcissism while defending against attributes it finds disturbing. Having distinguished between self and others, it seeks a convenient line of demarcation, a tangible anchor of an ever-shifting boundary, a collective consciousness to has a need to establish visible markers that distinguish it from others while it must be negated. Negated. Let me make sure. I think I got that word wrong. Hello everybody, hello Dialectical Menace. We're going over the dialectics of the oppressor and oppressed, colonize and colonized, colonizers and colonized, slave and master. N-E-G-O-T. There it is. I bet I got it right.
Negotiate.
Negotiate. Oh, sorry. It was negotiate. While it must also negotiate internal contradictions that threaten disintegration, the individual psyche may regulate to a undeveloped area. They use the GHETTO and project that which it finds unacceptable or threatening. As much as it needs affirmation from others, it also develops through confrontation with others. The collective consciousness too finds it easier to identify eternal scapegoats, to reaffirm its boundaries, and to regulate internal conflicts. The more the internal conflicts threaten disintegration, the more the collective consciousness restores to disparagement and persecution of others in hope to obtain a semblance of cohesion. Even in times of peace and relative tranquility, it performs rituals in which old warriors are remembered and earlier victories recounted. This dual process of differentiation and integration, negation, and synthesis is basic to the development of individuals and collective psyche. It so happens that people are oppressed not only to satisfy economic needs, but also to resolve more ambiguities, self-insecurities, or conflicts of identity. Oppression affords the partial solution for the oppressor, insomuch as it redefines an elusive boundary, provides scapegoats on which to unload unacceptable attributes and foster a sense of superiority. Thus, what Hegel discussed in terms of a struggle of recognition is essentially a struggle for identity, for introducing violence into a natural process of differentiation and integration. Oppression transforms normal conflicts into veritable crises. And if the development of identity requires both affirmation from others, the negation of at least some attributes, oppression renders all affirmation inauthentic and turns negation into violent confrontation. The process of internalization and objectification that Covey explained so well also are relevant to the psychology of oppression. For in prolonged oppression, the oppressed group willy-nilly internalize the oppressor without. They adopt his guidelines and prohibition. They assimilate his image and his social behaviors. They become agents of their own oppression. The oppressor, without becoming the inter-oppressor, an oppressor within. The well-known inferiority complex of the oppressed originates in this process of internalization. Because of its internalization and its attendant but repressed rage, the oppressed may act out on each other the very violent imposed on them. They become auto-oppressors as they engage in self-destructive behaviors, injurious to themselves, their loved ones, and their neighborhoods. Intropression refers to something more specific than Fanon's superego. Supergo. We're gonna find out if that's the right word. Hey, Dave. So what they're saying is that this relation arises the self-auto-destruction of an internal security force to keep the oppression going. So they create, the oppressors create the conditions for the self-oppression. Let's make sure this word's right. So when oppressed people turn against their other people that are being oppressed, it's because they can't outwardly, because Fanon says the only way to get out of oppression is to fight and not worry about dying, is to actually act in violence toward the oppressor, instead of acting violent towards yourself or to the other people that are being oppressed. You have to negate it, you have to act in defensive violence, counter violence. And if people say I'm wrong, you can say I'm wrong. And come up and please help me understand better. Oops. What is this? can refer to a few different. Okay, so it doesn't mean anything. I don't know. It isn't a symbol. It is a symbol of internalized aspects of oppression that prompts a betrayal of self and loved ones and plots of resistance. Often the oppressed acquire a victim complex and hence view almost all actions and communications as further assaults or simply other indications of their victim status. This is one expression of the adaptive paranoia, quote unquote, seen among the oppressed. The oppressor, too, are profoundly affected by the violence and dehumanization they impose on others. Their violent and dehumanization actions in time turn against them and reverberate in their psyche in social life, lives in social lives. So now they're talking about what this implementation does to the oppressor. Okay. Violent and inwardly, they use inwardly, to so many, yet wanting to love and be authentic to kin. The line of demarcation between we and they gradually blurs. They're violent and inwardly, the inward with proclivity to others comes to dominate their intimate social existence. The oppressor assimilates the cruel and harsh image they provoke in the oppressed. This fact is retropression. Thereby, violent and dehumanizing actions boomerang and their preparatory. I'm gonna look up this word. I tried. So they're saying that retroactive. We're gonna find out what they mean by that. Retropression.
Perpetrator.
That's perpetrator. Let's find out what retropression means. I bet they're going to describe it, but why not? Let's look at it ahead. Come on. Tion. Oh, it says retro oppression. No, a retro oppression. Doesn't say. Hold on. Is a psychological and sociological concept describing a boomerang effect, where the violent or dehumanizing actions of the oppressor psychologically backfire, ultimately hardening and degrading the perpetrator's own psyche and humanity. Okay. Further hardening the oppressor and their oppressive practices becomes further entrenched. The harsh actions on the oppressed, the unjust exercise of authority, and the subsequent lack of compassion, these gradually invade their family life and their dealings with loved ones. The state of affairs takes a toll and leaves its own psychological scars. Repressing guilt and fear of reprisal also come to dominate the psyche and social relations of the oppressor. But the oppressor, all they have to do is stop. Stop doing it! One common way in which oppressors attenuate the guilt of discomfort that rises from their violence and dehumanization is to impose further violence and further dehumanization. This is a Nero complex. Like Emperor Nero of Rome. The oppressor unjust prompts only further injustice. To repent and to make amends are not possible. Oppressors only concede to a relentless demand, rarely to reason or compassion, skillful in creating self-fulfillment prophecies. They conjure up the actualized victim who, quote, deserve, end quote, to be victimized. Oppressors find justifications and legitimacy only through greater violence and injustice. If Rome had to be burned to save it, the oppressed, too, are dehumanized to make them more human. The logic here is no doubt peculiar. peculiar, but it is quite prevalent in oppression. Consider children and in need of guidance. The oppressed are thought to benefit from the rigid discipline and raw justice. And if the victims cannot be physically alienated, then they can at least be psychologically manipulated. The oppressor, meanwhile, extols themselves and boasts of their glory while devaluing and debasing the oppressed. All these reinforce their feelings of omnipotence and superiority. The discussion of to die for freedom is a discussion to eject or kill oppressors, as well as real oppressors. To attain freedom, to change one's life for another, the oppressed must risk not only a deadly combat with the real oppressor, but also a perilous dislocation of the oppressor within. So they gotta get rid of the oppressor within. Got it. What's up, Flick? This is dual struggle, may thus result in death, wildness, and or freedom. It so happens that victims of prolonged oppression are more familiar with death and wildness, which pervade their social existence, than with how to obtain their freedom and take control of their destiny. Indeed, we point out earlier, prolonged oppression blurs the great divide between life and death, as well as the between sanity and wildness, mortality, incarceration, psychiatric hospitalization, in effect, different forms of stages of death, are appallingly pervasive among the oppressed. Yet the freedom for which they yearn requires that they first overcome their fear of physical death and their illusion of individual redemption. All individuals are mortal, and physical death can be postponed, but never avoided. Communities and cultures outlive individuals. Those who fear physical death and submit to oppression invariably condemn themselves to psychological, social, and historical death. Depersonalized, dissocialized, and derancinated, they become surrogates of the will of the self of others. Their psychological and social death only hastens their physical death, and as is well shown by their excess rates of morbidity and mortality among the oppressed. This is indeed one of the ironies of oppression. The oppressed submit for fear of psychological death, but because they submit, they become ill more frequently and die at earlier ages. The search for scrutiny and the search for security in conditions of oppression, the quest of personal harmony, the circumstances of social violence, or the wish of private success at the cost of betraying collective aspirations requires little originality, and risks become such efforts accept the status quo of oppression as immutable. Freedom requires new courage, new visions, new commitments. The dehumanizing master without must be killed, and at least psychologically, just as the slumbering slave within must be ejected. Neither can occur without willed organized action. Both entail risk of psychological crisis and even physical death. For then, and only then, can a given generation of oppressed effect change and reclaim their history. I think we're now on section 3, types of violence and the forms of death. But since we have hit the violence of the Manichaean psychology, violence and Manichaean psychology, we're going to go ahead and stop here. It's a good stopping point because it's good. I know it's 10 minutes early, but I don't think it matters.
That sounds good. What page?
Hold on. Still doing something. 146.
Okay. I think you explained everything really well as you read it, because you were going into detail on like all the important parts.
Yeah. Now what he's saying is like, oh my gosh, stop. Why is it doing this? Hold on. My pad's doing something weird. There we go, finally. Yeah, he does go into the fact that like the more that we do oppressions, the more that we manipulate, the more we turn inwards, because he said that, I don't know which book it was, but he talked about it where he was interviewing and he was doing psychological profiles of the people that are being tortured and the torturee. And like the torturee person, the person that was torturing, because of all that stuff, was very bad to his family and his children and to himself. You know what I mean? But like, and to that nature, you know what I mean? But he does come in, and this is where like I'm agreed that we need to release the change within ourselves. So what he's saying is like the person that's being oppressed needs to get rid of that within inside himself and fight for his life and do counter violence and to unalive whatever it takes to unalive the oppressor. You know what I mean? So like they because like the oppression makes people turn inwards towards their communities and to themselves, because they have nowhere to fight, because it's life or death. So that's the only way we're going to get out of this. That's the only way that non-white people can get out of this, is by the counter violence, you know, and relieving and turning their energies towards the oppressor instead of upon their own communities and stuff like that in themselves. But that's what oppression does. That's what white supremacy does, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions before I close it out? There's only 3 of us in here. Probably not. All right, then. We'll go ahead and just close it out for the night. And we'll continue tomorrow on part 3. All right.